Hey there, thanks for taking the time to join me again. Today we'll get started on a handler for signing up a user. More specifically, we'll work on binding the JSON request body to a struct. We'll also add a new method to our user service for signing up a user. We'll make sure to include this method in our mock as well so that we can begin adding our first tests for this method. In the next part, we'll create a new service which will handle creating tokens when a user successfully signs in, signs up, or tries to refresh tokens. And if that doesn't make too much sense now, we'll discuss it in subsequent tutorials. I'm now back inside of our go.mod file for our accounts project. I want to mention that I didn't use the name for the module that I had intended to, so let's fix that now. Normally, what you'll see in these paths is the full folder path to the project. So as you can see here, we're inside of the account folder of the Memorizer project. So I want to add account to the end of this path. So to do that, I'll get rid of it here. I'm just going to do a find all and then replace the current path with the account path. And I'll then hit enter and click this button to replace them all. It looks like there were 13 occurrences and they've all been replaced. So let's just go ahead and make sure we're in the account folder here in our terminal, and let's run the tests we've currently created with go test /.. meaning run tests for all of the currently available packages. And you can see that our tests are okay, and for the service and the handler, which are the current packages that we have tests for. All right, let's move on. So I've committed the change to the name of the module path. I had a few problems and I had to add a couple of commits, but let's hope it's good this time. So now let's go ahead and get started on creating the signup handler by creating a new file called signup.go. And then from this handler file, let's cut and paste the signup handler. And then let's make this package handler. And save and import, and things look pretty good. So let's move on and implement this handler. So the first thing we'll do in this handler is create a type signup_rec struct. And what this will do is it will define what we expect our incoming request body to the signup handler to look like. So we expect it to have an email and password of type string. Now, the actual JSON, though, will have a lowercase email and lowercase password. And we define these in the backticks with something called struct tags. So as you can see, we have JSON:\email and JSON:\password in quotes. We also have these binding tags, which we'll look at later, that are used with the validation library that Gin uses. We then create an instance of a variable called rec of the type signup_rec here. And we're going to eventually bind the incoming request data to this variable. So let's go ahead and get started on creating this bind data functionality. Since we'll be reusing this bind data a lot, I think it makes sense to add it to a separate file. So let's go to new file here. Call it binddata.go. Now, it may be useful to create this in some sort of sub package, but I'm not 100% sure what the best or customary way to do this is in industry. So if you have any ideas, please let me know in the comments. So we'll add let me correct that, binddata.go. And of course, this is also in package handler. All right. So before we create this bind data function, let's go ahead and look at the documentation for Gin. All right, I have the documentation here open for Gin on the section called Model Binding and Validation. So we can see that we have various methods for binding data to a variable or a struct in Go. And these different methods correspond to different data types. However, there's one method called shouldBind, and what this does is it determines which of the above methods to use depending on the content type header of the incoming request. For this application, we'll only work with JSON, and we'll expect that all of the requests come with the header application JSON. And if you remember in those struct tags that I just showed, let's go back to sign up here. We're only expecting JSON, so using should bind, which is here, should only know how to work with JSON in this application. Hope that makes pretty good sense. Now, going back again to this sign up request, we can see that we also have this binding tag, and then it has some sort of fields called required and email, and then required and GTE equals 6 or LTE equals 30. And these pertain to the library included in Gin called go-playground/validator. And this package has several built-in validators, such as required and that it's an email address, which will match the incoming JSON against some sort of regular expression for email. And in the case of password, we'll have a simple validation rule that says that it's between 6 and 30 characters in length. Now there's, what is a character, right? Or byte or char. You can look into that in detail in the documentation, which I'll show here. So let's go over to the validator package. And in this project, we'll be using version 10 of the Go Playground validator. So make sure in your imports that you have that. I had some problems earlier. You'll see in this documentation that they'll make use of a struct with some field of some name. And inside the backticks for the struct tags, they'll use the validate field. However, in Gin, it's important to note that we'll be using something called binding, which you'll see here, right? Binding. Otherwise, the behavior and how to use it is exactly the same as with the Go Validator library. That's what Gin is using under the hood. And without further ado, let's actually get around to creating this bind data function. Okay, back in the bind data file, let's get going. So first, I'll add a type called invalid argument with its corresponding JSON mapping or struct tags. We're going to extract from the Go Validator library a field, value, tag, and parameters that we'll find useful in sending error messages to user. And then we'll define the bind data function here, which will return a Boolean. What is this Boolean? It's basically telling us whether or not the bind data is successful. So if we get an error, we'll return false. And if the data is bound successfully, we'll return true, because we want the sign up handler and all handlers to handle the return execution or the sending of JSON. So that's why we're going to return this bool, and you'll see this a lot for errors or OK and casting variables in Golang. So let's go ahead and work on the bind data here, the actual function, and you can see it receives the Gin context to have access to Gin's methods like sending JSON, and it receives the request type, i.e. this sign up request in this case, which we want to bind the incoming JSON data to. All right, so I've copied some code here into bind data, and let's go over what it does. First of all, we're going to use that should bind method that we just looked at in the Gin documentation. And if we get an error, we're going to log it for internal use. And then we're going to see if we can cast this error to something called validator.validation errors, which is a type from the Go Validator or Go Playground Validator library. If we are able to cast that correctly, I'm going to create this invalid arg slice, or a slice of invalid arguments, which is this that we created here. And that's basically because I just wanted to grab a few of the fields from inside of the validation errors, or more specifically, field errors from the Go Playground Validator library. I always have to remember to say Playground because there's another Go Validator package and I don't want to cause confusion. Anywho, we'll just go over all of these validation errors and then get the properties field, value, tag, and parameter and add them to this slice. Then we'll create a custom error from our app errors package called new bad request, and this returns a status 404 error, as you can see here, with a message invalid request parameters, see invalid args. And then we send this error along with invalid args as JSON and return false, indicating that the binding didn't work. Now, this is the case when there are validation errors, or we can cast it to validation. What if we get some other binding error? In this case, we're going to create something called a fallback. And then here I just have a comment to remind me to do something later. But we're going to create a fallback error, which is just a 500 new internal error. And we'll return that and also say the binding failed. Lastly, if there is no error and the binding is successful, we'll go ahead and return true. So we're back inside of Signup now after having created the bind data function. And let's go ahead and call that function as follows. And basically, we're just binding the data to this request variable. And if it's not okay if there's an error, we return, because bind data function actually handles sending JSON. And we don't want to continue in this function and overwrite the JSON or the response body that we've already created. So let's save that. And the error has gone away. Good. The next thing we'll do here is call our service layer to create a user with the bound email and password. But we have yet to add such functionality to a user service. To do this, we need to create a signup method on the user service interface. So let's do that by opening up the model folder and going to interfaces. So we're going to add this to the user service here, but let's think about what we expect our signup method to do. Well, we've already made part of that decision by only accepting an email and password in the signup handler. We could have also accepted more information like name or image URL, but we'll handle updating user information in a separate method. So here's what I propose we do for our interface now. So here's our signup method. It will take the context, which can pass information between our various layers, such as a timeout, and then we'll also add a user. And this is our model user. You could call it a domain user that we created in model user here. And then we'll possibly return an error. And this error would be, for example, if you tried to create a user with an email that already exists, or if there was a database error, some error in another layer we'll be able to receive in our handler and forward on a message to the user as JSON or respond to the user with JSON. Now, you may be wondering, why don't we return a user like when we get? And that's because we already have a user referenced to as a parameter, and we can modify this user. For example, when we create the user in the database, we can append or add to this user struct reference. We can add a user ID in that case. And so we don't actually need to return another user here. And this seems more standard in Go. I don't know if it's the best practice, but I see it used very frequently in ORMs and other people's projects. So let's save this interface and let's go back to Signup and go ahead and call this method we've just created. Okay, so to call the method, we first have to create a user, and we then, in the email property or field and password, we add the fields from the request that's been bound, and then we say error and we call that method. If there's an error, we'll return or log a message that says failed to sign up user and provides the entire error message to our server for logging. And then we send an error to the user as JSON using this app_errors.status function. Now, this function was in our app errors here, and basically it's able to determine if the error is one of our custom errors. And if so, then it's able to determine from a mapping that we have in app errors what the status code is and handle the message. And in the case that it's not one of our errors, the status code will be a 500. So we'll just send this on the error key of JSON, and then we'll return so that nothing else is sent. So that's all we're going to do here in the signup handler for now, and let's move on to testing. But as you can see, before we can test and do anything else, we have some warnings or errors here. And what are they? They're that our mock user service and our actual concrete implementation of the user service are both missing the signup method. So we need to go ahead and implement these methods. So to implement these methods, let's first go to the user service. That's actually our user service mock. Let's go to the real user service and let's add it beneath this get method. Okay, we've added this method, and right now it doesn't do anything. It just panics if it calls, saying that the method isn't implemented. And often you might build out your whole interface and then add all of the methods in the implementation or the mock implementation, and one by one go implementing them. And the ones that aren't implemented, you might include a panic. So that's what we can do here, and we get rid of the warning. Let's go ahead and add a mock in user service. I'm not going to go over how we do this. We've done this in the last 2 lectures, which I highly recommend. I know they're long, but it's worth your time. I don't know what that was all about. All right, so let's go ahead at the bottom, and we'll say sign up as a mock, and we basically create the mock as we have before, and I recommend, again, you go check out the tutorials. Now all of our warnings have gone away, so let's get working on a test. To get working on the test, let's go to handler, create a new file, and we'll call it signup_test.go. All right, and this is package handler as well. And we're going to create an outer function that receives the Go testing package RT and sets up Gin to run in test mode. All right, I've added that code. So what can we test here? Let's think about it. We've currently implemented some validation logic, so we can definitely test if the validation fails. For example, you don't provide an email or password, or those fields are invalid. And we can also test that the proper error response is sent if calling the user service returns an error. For example, in that case we mentioned of the email address already existing. So let's forego testing the successful call to the user service, as we'll handle this next time. So let's get started with the email and password required test. So I've added this email and password required test and the accompanying imports. Inside, we create a mock user service from that mock we just defined, and we say that if we call the signup method, return nil. And really, we're only including this mock user service to make sure that this signup method does not get called. If we look at our signup method, if we have some sort of error binding data or validation error, then we shouldn't get to this signup point. Therefore, that's why we add it. We then create a response recorder to get the HTTP response. We set up Gin and the handler with our mock user service injected as before, and we create this request body with an empty email and then a missing password. These are treated given the validation rules I've provided, but you can also handle the difference between like a nil value email because an empty string is nil, or you can, I guess it's not nil, but a 0 value we'll say, versus the email or password not existing at all. In this application, an empty string will be treated the same as a missing field. We then send our request or prepare our request at the signup endpoint with a post method. And we, very importantly, set the header to application JSON under the content type header, as that's what our should bind is looking for, as we previously mentioned. We then serve this request on our router, and we make sure that the response code is 400, and also that the signup method does not get called. Our next test will be very similar, so let's just go ahead, and I'm going to copy this down with Shift-Alt down in VS Code, and we're going to change the name and a few fields. So the name change is to invalid email. Again, our mock is set up exactly the same. The only thing we want to do now is actually create a valid password. Let's say super secret 1234. And then an email that's invalid. Let's say bob@bob. There's no .com there, so should be invalid. And we'll do everything the same as before. Excellent. Next, let's do a different test. Instead of invalid email here, let's test for a password too short. All right, and let's go down to the body. And let's just say maybe super. And then we have to make the email valid. And you could do these tests to whatever extent you feel is necessary. This tutorial can't go on for 3 hours. And I just want you to learn how to do this, and you can add things on your own. Evidently, I'm missing a comma in the previous test. Okay, so that's our password too short. Let's do a password too long. And this time, let's maybe just go super 1, 2, 3, 4. I had some gibberish, but that's okay. And let's make sure this baby is, 30 characters or more. All right. And then we should still get the same error code. Now, again, it might be smart to make sure that you're getting the right errors in the response body, but let's keep it simple for today. That's actually a little tricky. And so I'm being a little lazy, to be honest. All right. So we've tested our validation fields. Let's now add that last test for when the user service is called, so we provide a valid request body, but there's some error down the line. For example, the user already exists. So let's call this one error calling user service, or maybe even error returned from user service. This time we have a valid password and email. We create our mock user service, and this time on calling the signup method, we want to return an app errors new conflict, and this is a status 409 error as seen in the comments there. And then this new conflict there, it's nice. It tells us what field has a conflict, or it allows us to provide that, and we'll use the email field of the user. Most everything else is the same, except that we need to assert a 409 error code, and that the actual method was called, so we use this assert expectations, which asserts that the signup method is called. I don't know what it is. Exerts a life without breath mints. I don't know. All right. So let's go ahead and run these tests, saving the file. And to run the tests for an individual package, remember, is go test the folder and then handler package. And then to get all of the files in the package, you can do ... And we get some error. Which one is getting an error? All of them are receiving a status of 500. So something is wrong in the code. Let's look at this. I didn't intend for this, but this is actually good. So we're getting the wrong error here. And I might have mentioned earlier, very importantly, that we need to use version 10 of Go Playground. So I messed this up once and I messed it up again. But hey, lesson to us all that this needs to be fixed. So let's go ahead and I'll get the proper library number here. So I'm going to copy this out and include version 10. So let's hope that the tests pass now. And they're okay. And if you want to run the verbose to see each individual test, then you see that they're passing. And you can do things in this test, going back to test, I was in bind data, sorry. If you go back here, you could say status 401, and it should hopefully fail because it expects 400. So that first one fails, and we can make it pass again. All right, I didn't quite do that as seamlessly as the last tutorials. I kind of winged it a little more, but I hope that you've enjoyed it. This stuff can be a little tough. It can be a little tedious. I can't relieve that tedium or the monotony, but I at least hope you've learned something useful and that this will help you figure out issues and how to test your handlers in your own projects. Thanks again for joining me, and please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you found it useful. Thanks again. Hasta luego. Ciao.